Chapter 30, Faint. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 30. Fainted. After the Qing clan warriors had joined Ji Xia's troop, the troop started moving forward faster than before. The Qing clan warriors were born in the jungle. The primitive jungle was like their own backyard. Additionally, the Magus priests in the Qing clan were the best at communicating with all kinds of magical creatures of the jungle, and deal with those poisonous miasmas. The 200 elite warriors that had come with Qing were leading the way at the front of the troop. The troop didn't encounter any problems due to their guidance. Wu Qing let out a shout, ran up, and jumped to grab a long vine, swung over the troop, then dropped himself onto a towering tree. He effortlessly found a couple of bird eggs in a nest, and poured them straight into his mouth. Qing wiped his mouth satisfied, then swung backwards. He flipped a few times in the air and quietly landed beside Ji Hao. Qing gave Ji Hao 2 bird eggs and tapped him on the shoulder. "Hey, Hao. Don't be so quiet. Why were you sitting here all day? You don't even look like a young man, you know. You look like those elders in the clan. Come on, follow me. Let's hang out. Look, over there. It's a nest full of iron-beak parrots." Qing shouted out abruptly and pointed at a tree miles away. Ji Hao was still turning his head to look at that tree while Qing had already hopped on a branch and shot an arrow. The sharp arrow whizzed through the air. A faint cyan light appeared behind Qing, and formed a pair of cyan wings which were rapidly flapping in the wind. The arrow was wrapped by a wisp of cyan smoke and darted miles away in the blink of an eye. The tree that Qing had pointed to was thousands of feet tall. Tens of beautiful iron-beak parrots were hovering and tweeting around a huge nest, built on a branch of that tree. All of those birds suddenly howled simultaneously and had been shot down by that one arrow shot by Qing. "Wow! Amazing!" Ji Hao popped up his eyes and exclaimed out loud. His eyesight was great, which allowed him to see clearly that all of those parrots had been pierced by the arrow through the middle of their eyes and were falling from the air. All of their feathers had remained undamaged though. "Of course." Qing leapt off and said proudly. "How, your dear uncle. I'm the most handsome man, the best shooter, and the youngest senior magus in the Qing clan," yelled Qing while he was leaping between branches. Qing didn't stop the boast. He quickly got under the towering tree and picked up those dead parrots. However, soon he started screaming and fleeing backwards, because a large group of ghost-faced bees were madly chasing after him. "Help! Xia! Brother! Help me! Damn! Bees! I hate these crazy bees. Why did they make a nest in the grass?" Qing put his arm around his own head and ran towards Ji Xia. The ghost-faced bees were not highly venomous, however, once stung by this kind of bees, the wounds would be itching like hell. Usually, people couldn't help but keep scratching their skins after having been stung by the ghost-faced bees. Sometimes they even scratched their own skins off. Ji Xia walked up to Qing half laughing and half annoyed. He grabbed Qing and threw him into the troop, then opened his mouth and spurted a large stream of fire, which burned those bees into ashes. Qing took a seat next to Ji Hao. He had not yet recovered from that fright. "Damn! Those mad bees!" Qing complained loudly. Ji Hao looked at him, laughed out, and said, "Uncle Ing. I thought you're the youngest senior magus in your clan. How could you be frightened by a group of bees?" Qing held his head high, looked at the rosy sun, and said shamelessly, "Of course I'm the youngest senior magus that I just haven't been able to awaken my magus acupoints yet." Qing had brought the troop a lot of fun during the journey. He was always jumping around like a monkey, making all kinds of small troubles, which made people laugh. Day after day, the troop was still traveling through the jungle. Qing loved hunting. He hunted a lot of beasts for Ji Hao to eat with his excellent hunting skills. Sometimes, Qing just simply wanted to shoot something. Ji Hao was practicing on the Bu Tian Bulu magic spell, which allowed him to swallow as much as he wanted. The two of them made a perfect team based on hunting and eating animals. With the power of the Bu Tian Bulu magic spell, Ji Hao was growing stronger and stronger. His body gained more power and his blood blushed the red net of bloodline power much quicker than before. Ji Hao's body had been improved by the dragon's blood. The potential of his body was far greater than that of an ordinary human being. Added with all of those beasts he had swallowed recently, Ji Hao's physical power had already gone far beyond the novice level. However, he intentionally was controlling his strength and power, keeping his grade at the 11th level as a novice magus. Soon, they had traveled for 50 days. It was a quiet afternoon. A few Qing Yi clan warriors flew back and shouted loudly. "Brother Ji Xia! Brother Ing! We're only 50 miles away from the Cold Stream Valley." Qing Ying was bored, and was sitting on the mammoth's leader's head, with his bow held in his hands. He let out a cheering sound when he heard those warriors, and darted away through the trees, disappearing quickly into the jungle, leaving a series of cyan-colored afterimages behind him. Ji Xia and Qing Fu stood up and looked into the jungle. With these mammoths, they could reach their destination in 2 hours at top. Ji Hao also stood up and looked into the jungle. The Cold Stream Valley, where Ji Shu wanted them to come. Ji Hao had made his mind up, no matter how difficult this would be, he was going to make Ji Shu and his people regret their decision, and accept the consequences. Ji Hao took a deep breath, turned around and smiled to Qing Fu, and tried to say something to her. Suddenly, a ball of fire spurted out from his chest. He felt as if a volcano had just erupted inside his body, a large amount of hot air released from his internal organs and steamed his bones and muscles. Ji Hao spat a mouthful of hot blood and made grabbing motions towards Qing Fu, but fainted then. The leather armor Ji Hao was wearing was burned out by his high body temperature. Tens of twisted blood-red spell symbols were emerging from the smooth skin of his slim yet sturdy body. Those spell symbols were continuously beating and quickly disintegrating one after another. Is the magic seal cast by Magus Priest Ji Kuei disappearing? This. Ji Kuei had said that this magic seal would gradually disappear after Hao's physical strength reached beyond the junior level. Qing Fu and Ji Xia exclaimed simultaneously. Ji Hao saw countless phantoms flashing through his eyes, his ears were buzzing and he couldn't hear Qing Fu or Ji Xia. Ji, the senior magi blood. Little guy, that couple, who you call Abba and Amma, they love you so much. The tie of blood. Even I am jealous of you. The voice of the mysterious man came from Ji Hao's spiritual space. Chapter 31, Wake. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 31. Awakened. Bov Ji Hao felt utterly powerless. He saw a simple and crudely built cave, with tens of torches placed on the wall. He also saw a primitive altar that was carved out of a single piece of stone. A huge three-legged gold fire crow totem was painted on the wall with the blood of an unknown beast mixed with mineral pigments. Under the firelight, the gold crow's eyes were shining with a magical light, and looked down at Ji Hao. Ji Hao could sense the wild and ancient vibe this cave was emitting. He felt as if he was wrapped in an intangible atmosphere. He could hear countless voices whispering in his ears. My dear ancestors. I, Ji Xia, am giving my blood to my child, in order to increase his power and strength, and wish him a better future. My dear ancestors, please bless my child. Please make him stronger than me, make him the best warrior in the southern wasteland. I want him to regain the glory of the gold fire crow and restore the status of our clan. Ji Xia was praying loudly. He put Ji Hao on the altar, and looked down at him. His eyes were full of love. He grinned, then pulled out a bone knife, and quickly cut his own wrist with it. Qing Fu had been sitting beside Ji Xia. At this moment, she stood up and started to recite an ancient spell. She looked pale and weak. Accompanying her voice, a strange humming noise was coming from the air. Blood was dripping from Ji Xia's wrist. These drops of blood weren't falling directly onto the altar, but were instead floating above Ji Hao. Every drop of blood was slowly wriggling and changing its shape under Qing Fu's control. In the end, these drops of blood gathered and formed a head-sized gold fire crow that emitted great heat and an intense light. Qing Fu then cut her own wrist as well, and directed her blood into the gold fire crow. My dear ancestors, gods, and ghosts. I, Qing Fu, beg you to be compassionate to us. Please bless my son with health, safety, and happiness. After her blood had melted into the blood-formed crow, countless spell symbols started to emerge from the blood-formed crow. Qing Fu's face became even paler. The newborn Ji Hao was lying on the altar, while gazing at his parents stunned. The blood-formed crow slowly descended from the air, and merged into Ji Hao's body. Followed by a thundering bang, a gust of cold wind broke into the cave, with countless black ice knives wrapped within it. A couple of badly mutilated human bodies were thrown into the cave by the sharp wind. These were the guards of the Fire Crow clan's ancestral temple. Their muscular bodies were almost torn to pieces by the ice knives, and the shock had been frozen onto their simple and honest faces. Qing Fu and Ji Xia jerked their heads around, and saw a bucket-thick, 100 feet long, one-horned black serpent wriggling into the cave while it was spurting the cold air with its venom out of its huge mouth. The serpent saw Ji Hao, who was lying on the altar, and its huge tail then heavily whipped towards Ji Hao. Ji Xia had just given more than half of his blood to Ji Hao, which reduced his power greatly. Once he saw this serpent, he let out a growl. 2 streams of flames then darted out from both of his arms. A dragon scale shield, and a mulberry wood spear appeared within the flames. The shield blocked the serpent's tail, which was only inches away from Ji Hao's tiny body. At the same time, the spear pierced the serpent's head with a lightning speed. Who are you? How dare you have invaded into our holy land? Ji Xia shouted out. His voice showed a trace of confusion. How did you get in? This is our ancestral temple. This is the Fire Crow clan's holy land. While Ji Xia was shouting at the serpent's body exploded into a cloud of black smoke. A black figure emerged from that smoke and waved its hands towards Ji Xia. The next second, over 20 black ice knives darted out from that smoke and punctured all of the Magus acupoints, which had been glowing brightly on Ji Xia's chest. Blood spurted out from his wounds, and splashed all over Ji Hao's body. Qing Fu let out a scream, and pulled 3 black long needles from her coiled hair, which she then threw towards that black figure. The 3 black needles pierced the figure's body, it let out a howl, opened its mouth and breathed out a wisp of cold air. The cold air suddenly transformed into 3 thumb-thick ice knives, and then went through the 3 Magus acupoints on Qing Fu's chest. Beside a blazing bonfire, the little Ji Hao was curiously staring at Ji Kuei with his bright, watery eyes. Ji Kuei was wearing a bone armlet and a leather cloak. Those damn stinking snakes. I curse their souls to burn in the fire of the gold crows and never be set free. Oh, look at our little one, such a talented Magus priest. His spiritual power is already as strong as that of an ordinary Magus priest. Even though he is only a newborn, such a lovely creature, they had almost killed you. Ji Kuei then bit his own finger and drew a set of complicated spell symbols on Ji Hao's body with his blood. Xia, you didn't finish your blessing ceremony. You and Qing Fu's blood has missed the perfect moment to merge with our little one's body. I can only seal your blood inside his body with my magic spell. This magic seal will gradually disappear after his physical strength has reached the junior level, after which your blood will be absorbed by his body. Don't worry, nothing can ruin his talent. My magic seal might affect him during his warrior training, but he still will be a powerful Magus priest. Such a powerful soul, such a talented Magus priest. Ji Hao groaned, then opened his eyes. He saw the black roof of a cave and also felt a soft fur beneath his body. There was a bitter taste remaining in his mouth, which was so familiar. That was the medicine made by Ching Fu. The fat bear put its head near Ji Hao's face and gave a large grin when it realized that Ji Hao had awakened. "Hey, fatty. Where's Amma?" Ji Hao looked at the slobber that hung at the corners of bear's mouth and asked. He then pushed the bear's head aside. The internal heat inside his body had been resealed. He sensed that the senior Magi's blood from his parents was floating above the multicolored flame in his dantian. The flame was working hard to transform the senior Magi's blood into beams of multicolored lights, which his body could absorb. Ji Hao felt an inexhaustible power from his body. He looked at the cave wall next to him, then chopped it with his hand. His hand made a deep cut into the rock wall. He felt as if he was cutting a piece of tofu with a sharp knife. His strength didn't seem to have made significant improvement, but his had become sturdier. There was still 90% of Senior Magi's blood that hadn't been released yet. As for the blood that had already been released, more than half of it was waiting to be transformed by the multicolored flame. Senior Magi's blood, so powerful. Ji Hao leaped up from the ground, and waved his fists. He looked around, then walked out of the cave. He saw a stream that flowed rapidly towards the east. A beautiful and broad valley was quietly lying under the starlight. Thousands of slaves, bearing their bodies, were singing a work song, while being busy lumbering with sweat pouring down their backs. A haughty voice came from not far away. "Ji Xia, you're no longer the leader. You're just like us now. What makes you think you could talk to us like that?" Chapter 32, The Coldbrook Valley. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 32. The Cold Stream Valley. What do you mean, don't talk to me like that? Look what you've done. It has been nearly 2 months since you've been given this job. The Mountain of Springs, where you and these slaves have come from, is only hundreds of miles away from here. And these slaves haven't even built their own shelters as of yet. You had plenty of time and all these people. But you didn't even start to build a mineshaft. What have you been doing all these days? I'm not finished yet. Could you please tell me where the food for these slaves is? Where is the meat for our companion beasts and beasts that were carrying our stuff? Where are all the equipment we are going to need for exploration and mining work? You just wasted a whole 2 months here. Under the starlight, Ji Xia was waving his arms and yelling at 2 men, who seemed lazy and haughty. The 2 men were wearing metal armors, which were very rare in the southern wasteland. After Ji Hao heard Ji Xia's voice, he stopped walking, and watched quietly from the shade of the cave. He could sense strong powers coming from the heavy swords that they had worn around their waists. Faced with Ji Xia's complaints, the 2 men showed arrogant faces, and didn't seem to take Ji Xia's words seriously at all. "Ji Xia, you can say whatever you want. We have sent the 5,000 slaves to you as we've been told. From now on, you're responsible for the mining work in the Cold Stream Valley, as well as all other affairs around here, which have nothing to do with us." The 2 men laughed out loud and whistled sharply. 2 iron-clawed bald eagles with wingspans of tens of feet, landed not long after in front of them. The 2 men hopped on the backs of the eagles then rapidly rose high into the air, hovered around, and flew towards the gold-black mountain. Ji Xia raised his right arm angrily, but then stopped, his arm froze in the air. If it had been as before, any man that Ji Xia discovered to be muddling through their work, would be slapped hard in the face by Ji Xia, without hesitation. However, precisely as those 2 men had said, he was no longer the leader of the Holy Land's warriors, which meant he had no right to do so anymore. Mr. Crow abruptly landed on Ji Hao's shoulder. Ji Hao then walked up to Ji Xia, looked at the 2 eagles which were gradually becoming smaller and smaller in the sky, and said, "Abba, are they Ji Shu's people? Do you want me to shoot them down?" Mr. Crow cawed aloud, spurted wisps of fire from its beak. Qin Ying quietly showed up beside Ji Hao. He pulled out an arrow and started yelling excitedly while he was waving that arrow. Yes. Hao's right. Let's shoot those bastards down. I only need a single shot for them from this distance. Ji Xia put his arm down, tapped Ji Hao's head, and said smilingly. Don't. It was their fault for not doing their job well. But, we can never violate the rule of our clan. We can never take the initiative to hurt our own people. Ji Hao gazed at Ji Xia's pallid face. His mind flashed back to what he had seen during his time in coma. He clearly remembered that Ji Xia had blocked that attack with his own chest. The boiling hot blood of Ji Xia had splashed on his body and face. Ji Hao would never forget that. Sure, I won't do anything to them. Unless they do something to me first. Ji Hao smiled to Ji Xia, then turned around and started to observe this valley carefully. The starlight was bright and clear. Where Ji Hao was standing at, was the center of the valley. This valley was tens of miles long and miles wide. A stream with a width of 1,000 feet was flowing rapidly through the middle of the valley. At the sides of the stream there were piles of gold and jade pieces. The water of the stream was ice cold. Though Ji Hao was a mile away from the stream, he could still sense the chill coming from it. Ji Hao could hear the swishing and gargling sound of the water washing out those gold and jade pieces at the sides of the stream. Those gold and jade pieces were shining alluringly. Such an amazing load, said Ji Hao. Indeed, it's a surprisingly large and rich load. After we got here, your Amma did some exploration. She discovered that the mineral resources here are buried relatively less deep, which will be easy to dig. We can easily get 100,000 pieces of gold and tens of thousand pieces of jade from this valley. Ji Xia then frowned and continued. But those bastards from the Mountain of Springs only sent us 5,000 of slaves with nothing else. All kinds of knocking noises were resounding through the valley. Thousands of slaves were singing their working songs, while being busy with building their shelters. On the other side of the valley, tens of cabins on stilts had already been built. On the cliff, tens of Fire Crow clan warriors were working hard on building the watch post. A few long vines were dropped down from the cliff, and were used to pull thick logs up the cliff from time to time. Near the entrances, on both sides of the valley, a group of warriors were supervising hundreds of slaves building the fence wall. The slaves laid the foundation of the fence wall with thick logs, then filled 2 lines of logs with rocks and clay. This kind of fence wall would be firm enough to block the attacks from beasts. The Cold Stream Valley was in the extreme north of the Fire Crow clan's territory. The valley was surrounded by primitive jungle. A lot of dire beasts were living in the surrounding jungle of the Cold Stream Valley. That added with other unpredictable dangers. If this fence was not built as quickly as possible, the lives of all these slaves would be in constant peril. Qing Fu came with a few warriors. She smiled when she saw Ji Hao and intimately rubbed his head. Qing Fu then handed a fist-sized piece of red jade to Ji Xia and said, Xia, this load not only produces gold and jade. I asked these warriors to dug dirty feet deep and we found this. Ji Hao looked at that piece of red jade curiously. That red jade was translucent and possessed great heat. There seemed to be some kind of liquid flowing inside it. Under the starlight, this red jade piece was shining with a bright fiery light. Fire jade pith. This is a treasure that can largely and rapidly improve the power of a senior magus with the natural abilities of controlling fire, and is also a kind of excellent material for making magus tools. Ji Xia popped up his eyes and said delightfully. If this is sent to the clan as tribute, 1 piece of fire jade pith can be worth more than thousands of gold and jade pieces of gold. We have to let those elder magus priests know that we have found the fire jade pith here, as quickly as possible. Tell them that they should send more warriors to guard this valley. And, Xia, you need to start hunting with Ing after the sun has risen. Those people of the Mountain of Springs didn't bring any food for these slaves, said Ji Fu in a low voice. Ji Hao took the fire jade pith from Ji Xia's hand, after which he sent his spiritual power into it. He suddenly sensed a great power gushing into his body from his palms. He felt as if he had been drawn into a lake of lava, and almost screamed out. Ji Hao was half shocked and half surprised. This piece of red jade was not a fire jade pith, but a piece of fire essence crystal. In Ji Hao's previous life he had seen hundreds of powerful warriors fighting for a small piece of fire essence crystal that had been less than 1% in size compared to the one he was holding right now. BDNVLDM, this was truly precious. The Cold Stream Valley was a great treasure trove indeed. No matter who it was that guarded this valley and was sending the gold and jade pieces, as required from him, he would be rewarded and earn credit from the clan. Would Ji Shu be kind enough to let Ji Xia earn such credit? Chapter 33, Savage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 33. Savage. The fat bear immersed its entire body in the stream, after which it slapped its huge bare palms hard onto the surface of the water. The water splashed and brought up a 5-feet-long fish, which was pure white and without scales. The fat bear made its drooling mouth wide open, caught the fish, and swallowed it instantly. After that it let out a few cheers. In the valley, one group of slaves were still working hard to build shelters and the fence wall. The remaining slaves had already started making simple stone tools for mining work under the supervision of a few Fire Crow clan warriors. Ji Hao was standing on the fence wall, which was nearly built, and frowned while looking at those slaves who seemed to be lifeless. In the southern wasteland, the mining work had always been extremely dangerous and heavy. Even a strong man with a healthy body would probably be disabled after working in the deep and dark mine shaft for 2 or 3 years. However, there were very few healthy men among the slaves Ji Hao was looking at. Nearly half of them lacked an arm or a leg. The rest of them were either children or old people. There were even a few sick people who couldn't walk straight. Half of them wouldn't last even a minute in the mineshaft. Where did Ji Shu find all this garbage? Ji Hao thought. Ji Hao gave a sigh, then shouted to Ji Ying, who was supervising those slaves, "Uncle Ji Ying, just pity those poor kids. Set them off into the jungle to find some fruits. They can do nothing around here anyway." Ji Ying was holding a whip with which he lashed the ground, annoyed, then took a glance at those poor scrawny kids who couldn't even carry a piece of wood, and growled. "Damn Ji Shu. When I become stronger, I'll have to kick his ass and teach him some rules. Take these useless kids away. The 2 of you. Send them to the back of the valley where there is a piece wood with wild fruits. Let them fill their stomachs, after which they will have to bring all those fruits back to us." Ji Ying said to a couple of warriors who were standing behind him. Ji Hao shook his head, then turned around, and looked into the dense jungle. In the morning, just after the sun had come out, Ji Xia had gone into the jungle and started hunting with a group of warriors. Feeding thousands of people wasn't easy at all, and would need at least hundreds of big animals to be hunted. A few slaves were carrying huge stones even taller than themselves on their backs and gasping heavily. They walked up beside Ji Hao step by step, then put those stones into the fence wall heavily. The bodies of these slaves were bare, without even a leaf to cover their private parts. Tattoos of crocodiles on their skins showed that they had come from the Blood Crocodile clan, which was a subsidiary clan of the Blackwater Serpent clan. The Fire Crow clan and the Blackwater Serpent clan had been fighting against each other for decades. It was not uncommon for them to capture and enslave people from each other or their subsidiary clans. Ji Hao checked the few slaves working beside him with his spiritual power, and discovered that they were all novice magi under the 2nd level. Yo-ho-ho-ho yo. Ho-ho, a strange shouting sound came from the jungle. A few figures flashed through the jungle, then countless trees started shaking. A couple of spears darted out of the jungle along with the ear-piercing sounds of sharp winds created by them. In the next second, a few slaves were speared and nailed on the fence wall. Enemies. While Ji Hao was shouting, a tall and strong man rushed out of the woods and ran up to Ji Hao. This man was almost naked, his waist was wrapped around by a small piece of fur, and his whole body was covered with thick black hair. He was holding a wooden stick in his hand. The wooden stick he was holding in his hand had the same thickness as Ji Hao's lap and the same length as Ji Hao's height, and was covered in dried-up blood. The man was only an inch shorter than Ji Hao, but his shoulder was half a foot wider than Ji Hao's shoulder, which made him seem like a human-like chimpanzee. He raised the stick high in the air, then let out a growl and smashed it down towards Ji Hao's head at the same time. Ji Hao grabbed a spear, which was leaning against the fence wall beside him, then let out a growl as well. The appearance of enemies was too abrupt, and had left Ji Hao no time to cast any sorceries or magic spells. He could only fight back with his physical strength. All of the black hair that was covering the strong man's body stood then straight up, and a cloud of black smoke appeared faintly behind his body. Inside the smoke, a red tiger head was roaring silently. A wisp of powerful black smoke then spurted out from the stick and transformed into a tiger claw, which slapped towards Ji Hao's face with great speed. Obviously, this strong man was a junior Magus warrior. Only magi at the junior or higher level could transform their powers into a certain shape. Usually, the strength of a Magus would go beyond 20,000 stones, when he or she reached the top level as a novice Magus. Once he or she upgraded to a junior Magus, his strength would grow to 30,500 stones at least. Added with his or her bloodline power, the punch of a junior Magus would at least be 2 times stronger than a top-level novice Magus. Before Ji Hao could trigger his internal power, the spear bumped against the stick. The strong man stared happily at Ji Hao. He only saw a ball of faint light shining behind Ji Hao, which meant that Ji Hao had already started to make the connection with his bloodline power but hasn't triggered it yet, and Ji Hao was only a 12th level novice Magus tops. Die. Meat, delicious kid. The strong man murmured, his arms started swelling, which showed that he had used all his strength. Savage. Damn cannibal savage. Fight. Fight. Kill them all. Damn. Ji Hao. Step back. Quick. Bang. The spear and the wooden stick simultaneously exploded into pieces. The explosion hadn't hurt Ji Hao at all. He slightly shook his arms and looked at the strong man. He discovered that the man was not as powerful as he had thought. Contrary to Ji Hao, both of the palms of the strong man had been broken into several pieces, blood spurted out from his wounds. He stared at Ji Hao in shock while he was sent flying backwards. Kill. Ji Hao growled. He was half shocked and half surprised. He was controlling his power and strength intentionally and keeping himself at the 11th level as a novice Magus. However, he had only used 6% of his physical strength just now and completely beat a junior Magus up. The magical, Bu, Tian Bulu magic spell, gained me extra strength, the dragon blood gave me a perfect human body, and the senior magi blood from Abba and Amma, it was so powerful. Ji Hao cheered silently in his head. He then let out a growl, grabbed a pair of axes from the hands of 2 warriors and rushed towards the strong man. Tens of savages rushed out of the woods while screaming and shouting. Ji Hao waved the axes and broke into the crowd of savages like a whirlwind. Soon, the tens of 5th to 6th level novice magi savage warriors were all chopped into pieces by Ji Hao. Blood splashed everywhere. Kill. Ji Hao growled hoarsely. His pupils turned red. More savages rushed out of the woods continuously. Ji Hao madly darted towards them. Hundreds of savages were slaughtered by Ji Hao in the blink of an eye. The ground was littered with body pieces. Suddenly, an angry growl came from the jungle. A 3-meter tall man who was plump and sturdy rushed out. 3 red light spots were brightly shining on his chest, which meant that he was a senior Magus who had 3 Magus acupoints awakened. The senior Magus savage grabbed a savage warrior who was running beside him and threw him hard forward. The poor savage warrior let out a deep howl while darting towards Ji Hao like a human cannonball. Ji Hao sensed a strong wind coming along with the human cannonball when it was still tens of feet away from him. He felt a strong chest pain and he couldn't even breathe. Chapter 34, For Eyes. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 34. For Eyes, Break. Facing the poor savage warrior who had been thrown at him as a human cannonball, Ji Hao dropped the axes, locked his fingers together, then silently cast a spell. At the same time, he thrust his hands forwards, with his palms facing the savage warrior who was about to hit him. The spell and hand gesture cast by Ji Hao made a connection with the vast nature power, which had now gathered into an invisible wall, shielding Ji Hao behind it. The poor human cannonball warrior exploded into a red cloud of mist accompanied by a loud bang, once he hit against the invisible nature-powered wall. The air shock waves even sent Ji Hao flying backwards. Mr. Crow didn't take any action. He gripped Ji Hao's shoulder and gazed at the jungle behind the savage senior Magus with his red and beady eyes, without even taking a glance at the savage senior Magus. "Juicy little kid, you smell so good, must be tasty." The savage senior Magus roared and took a big step towards Ji Hao. He was nearly 100 feet away from Ji Hao, however, with a single step, he was now standing right in front of Ji Hao. "Go away. You disgusting fat." The horrible smell of the savage senior Magus almost made Ji Hao throw up. He overlapped his hands with a frown and quickly triggered his internal power. Soon, all of his internal power had condensed into a thumb-sized fiery lightning ball on top of his palm. The fiery lightning ball then swelled into the size of a human head. Followed by an earth-shaking thunder, a 10-feet-long lightning darted out of the fiery lightning ball and struck right onto the huge fat belly of the savage senior Magus. The lightning instantly burned out the dense black hair on the belly of the savage senior Magus and his dirty, oily skin laid bare. Countless sparks of lightning wrapped his body and made loud crackling noises. Some of the lightning sparks struck on the ground and left hundreds of fist-sized holes. The savage senior Magus held his own stomach with trembling hands and staggered a few steps back. Although Ji Hao would never be able to hurt the savage senior Magus with his own physical strength, he had triggered the 9th secret word, and borrowed power from the nature, which temporarily yet largely improved his power and strength. Even so, he still failed to cause any harm to the body of the savage senior Magus. But he had successfully forced the savage senior Magus back. "Little bastard. I'm going to eat your brain." The savage senior Magus let out a roar and stamped down hard on the ground, causing an intense ground shake, which nearly made Ji Hao fall. Ji Hao retreated rapidly. "Savage. This is our Fire Crow clan's territory. Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Ji Ying flew towards Ji Hao with a spear held in his hand. His body was wrapped by a fire stream, which made him look like a fiery shooting star. He then landed in front of Ji Hao and firmly shielded him behind himself. The spear made of mulberry wood was sparking and the obsidian spearhead was spurting flame flakes. Ji Ying then lunged his spear at the chest of the savage senior Magus for hundreds of times, in the blink of an eye. However, Ji Ying's attacks seemed to be hardly hurting the savage senior Magus. The savage senior Magus stood firmly on the ground and put his palms together, a mace, tattoo on his right palm lit up, and then a mace appeared in his hand. Ji Ying only had 2 awakened Magus acupoints, while the savage senior Magus had 3 of them. Judging from their physical strengths, Ji Ying was not the rival of the savage senior Magus at all. The mace and Ji Ying's spear struck against each other, the shock impact pushed Ji Ying backwards and made him fall hard on the ground. A small part of Ji Ying's leather armor broke into pieces by a slight touch of the mace. Along with a sharp wind, Ji Lang, who was guarding the back of the valley, flew up to Ji Ying. Similar to Ji Ying, his body was wrapped by a fire stream as well. He flashed across the air and switched position with Ji Ying, then leaped up and jammed his knees hard onto the face of the savage senior Magus. The face of the savage senior Magus was smashed instantly. Blood spurted out from out his eyes and ears. He howled desperately, threw his mace away, turned around, fled backwards with his face buried in his hands. At this time, Ji Ying was already standing back up. He held his spear tight and darted towards the savage senior Magus at a lightning speed. At the next second, the spear went through the chest of the savage senior Magus and punctured his heart. The savage senior Magus screamed out, twitched a few times, then fell onto the ground. Thousands of savage warriors rushed out of the woods. However, all of them froze when they saw the savage senior Magus lying on the ground and covered with blood. They gazed stunned at the savage senior Magus, the most powerful warrior within their tribe. Their best warrior had been beaten up, which had frightened them badly. They didn't know what to do next. The savages were the robbers living in the jungle of the southern wasteland. They didn't have a homeland, they didn't know how to plant or raise animals. Neither did they have any idea about Magus priest or elder magi. They would eat every old or weak member of their own tribes. Just like wild animals, they moved around the southern wasteland jungle, robbed every clan they met and ate whatever they could find, including people. The savage senior Magus was the leader of this savage tribe, and was also the most powerful warrior among them. The rest of the savage warriors started yelling and screaming when they realized that their leader had already been knocked down. Inside the dense jungle, a tall figure in black was standing in the shadow of a tree and murmured dissatisfied. "Told you. These trashes are useless. They're even more stupid than animals. We have to do it ourselves if we want the prize." The tall figure then walked out of the shadow and said, "Let's make it quick. The two senior magi just had their Magus acupoints awakened, they're not bad. Besides, they're tall and pretty, those old ladies gonna like them. They'll be worth a fortune." Another tall future walked out as well and said, "Let's do it together then. Catch them alive as quick as possible. And that little guy, he can cast a spell at such a young age. More importantly, look at that delicate face, someone's gonna pay lots for that." Ji Hao picked up the axe which was thrown on the ground by himself earlier and chopped the neck of the savage senior Magus. He used all of his strength, chopped the neck of the savage senior Magus hard for nearly 100 times, then finally beheaded him. The body of the savage senior Magus was still twitching intensely after that. A while later, a huge stream of blood spurted out from his broken neck and the twitching stopped. Such a strong life force. And he was a senior Magus with only 3 awakened Magus acupoints. Ji Hao exclaimed silently. Then Ji Hao heard these heavy footsteps coming from the jungle. He suddenly sensed a murderous vibe. Ji Hao then raised his head and saw 2 men were walking out of the jungle. Both of them were over 3 meters tall and wearing full metal armors. Except their faces, all of their body parts were well protected by the exquisitely crafted armors, including fingers. Their faces were in an odd bronze color. One of them was holding a bola, too, and the other one was holding a heavy sword. Ji Hao stared at the faces of the 2 men in shock. Both of them had an additional pair of eyes located above their eyebrows. They were 4-eyed people. "Fight. Fight with your full strength. Damn. It's the Jia clan warriors," shouted Ji Ying and Ji Lang simultaneously. 1. Mace. A mace is a blunt weapon, a type of club or verge that uses a heavy head on the end of a handle to deliver powerful blows. A mace typically consists of a strong, heavy, wooden or metal shaft, often reinforced with metal, featuring a head made of stone, copper, bronze, iron, or steel. 2. Bola. A type of weapon in use during the Clone Wars and later the Galactic Civil War, consisting of weights attached to an interconnected cord. The weapon was capable of wrapping around an individual's neck and breaking it. Chapter 35, Invulnerable. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 35. Invulnerable. Ji Hao felt as if an electric current had passed through his body, there were goosebumps over his entire body and the tiny hairs on his body were all standing up. He detected all sorts of emotions contained in the shouts of Ji Ying and Ji Lang, tension, shock, and even a slight trace of fear. Ji Lang and Ji Yang held their head high and their weapons tight, while taking 3 steps forward and faced the 2 clansmen of the Jia clan bravely. They might not be aware of the fear buried deep inside their own hearts, but Ji Hao certainly was. "Uncle Ji Ying, what the hell is the Jia clan?" Ji Hao looked at the 2 four-eyed men walking quickly towards him and shouted to Ji Ying. "Withdraw." "How?" "Back." Ji Ying gripped his spear and growled. Streams of fire spurted out from his body turning almost translucent in the raging fire. "They're monsters from the Jia clan. Stay away from them." Hee. The Jia clan warriors curved their lips and chuckled in disdain. Looking at the inhumane enemies, Ji Hao took a deep breath. The purple light spot which was condensed by his internal power appeared between his eyebrows and started rotating rapidly, continuously drawing the surrounding power of the nature into Ji Hao's body. Ji Hao's body trembled a bit, after which he started reciting the 9 secret words. At that moment, Ji Hao's silhouette became hazy and indistinct. Followed by a muffled thunder in the air, Ji Hao pointed his left hand towards the sky and his right hand towards the earth. His pupils were shining with a chilling cold light. At the same time, a chilling wind whooshed through the air. The ground under the feet of the 2 Ji clan warriors started moving like water. Tens of arm-thick thorns of dirt thrust out from the ground. The tips of these thorns were shining with the same chilling cold light as that in Ji Hao's eyes. Under the control of Ji Hao's power, the hardness of these thorns were greater than that of steel. However, these sharp and hard thorns shattered into dust against the armors of the Jia clan warriors. The Jia clan warriors stood still, but their armors were shining without even a trace left by those thorns. Their mocking laughter turned louder and their eyes turned colder. Ji Hao snapped all the plants in the vicinity to shake suddenly. Hundreds of towering trees withered and collapsed and large patches of grass scorched rapidly. Only a few plants near the 2 Jia clan warriors were wrapped by a green light and started growing madly, their leaves and vines expanded over hundreds of times in the blink of an eye. Under influence of Ji Hao's magic power, these leaves and vines became as hard as rebar and coiled around the bodies of the Jia clan warriors like serpents. Those huge vines continued coiling around the Jia clan warriors and wrapped them into a large green cocoon, after which it started wriggling and ringing, making a gravelly raucous noise. Such a boring trick. A cold and glib voice came from within the green cocoon. Just when the voice faded, the cocoon busted open due to a power at the inside. Countless pieces of leaves and vines were blown away by the power of the impact. The 2 Jia clan warriors calmly broke loose from the cocoon and continued walking in big steps. "How? Step back." Ji Lang growled. "These Jia clan people are monsters. Only a senior magus can deal with them." Ji Hao didn't listen to Ji Lang. He locked his fingers together and triggered the 9 secret words, in order. The power of the 9 secret words allowed Ji Hao to connect his own internal power to the power of nature. The nature power around him started rotating like an invisible whirlpool. A small spark emerged from the air, then started a great fire around Ji Hao. 9 armed, thick and tens of feet long, fiery snakes darted out of the blazing fire and rushed towards the Jia clan warriors, emanating great heat. The fiery snakes hit right onto the chests of the Jia clan warriors, but they didn't even blink when it happened. They only threw a mocking glance at Ji Hao and kept walking. The 9 fiery snakes exploded with a loud bang at the very next second, shedding sparks and smoke, and fell with a great splashes of fire near their heavy armors, failing to leave even any trace on them. Ji Hao attacked the Jia clan warriors over 3 times with all of his best sorceries. The lethality of his attack was even greater than that of an elite junior warrior's attack. However, the two Jia clan warriors weren't harmed even a little bit. Ji Hao couldn't sense any magic power from the two Jia clan warriors, which meant that they took all of attacks only with their strangely strong defensive capability. Shoot! Growls of a few Qin Yi clan warriors came from behind Ji Hao. Tens of long arrows hurtled towards the Jia clan warriors. The Jia clan warriors gave a scornful laugh, then closed their eyes. The Qin Yi clan warriors were the best archers in the southern wasteland. The tens of arrows hit onto closed eyes of the Jia clan warriors almost simultaneously, which gave Ji Hao a spurt of great joy. However, after less than 1 second, his heart sank heavily. He felt cold and hopeless, like he was drowning in the cold stream in the middle of the valley. All of the Qin Yi clan warriors guarding the Coldbrook Valley were middle-level junior magi, even some elite junior magi. The arrows shot by them could easily puncture tens of towering trees over miles away. But just now, their arrows had clashed against the eyelids of the Jia clan warriors. The Jia clan warriors blinked and shook off the dirt left by smashed arrows. After that, they took a few big steps forward, and walked up to Ji Ying and Ji Lang. Ji Hao stared at the two Jia clan warriors nervously. What kind of freaks were they? Even their eyelids were indestructible, like iron walls, and had shattered the arrows of the best archers in the southern wasteland. Ji Hao thought. Ji Ying darted out ahead of Ji Lang. He leapt up from the ground, held his spear high and pierced towards one of the Jia clan warriors' heart. At the same time, the spearhead spurted out a raging flame. Ji Ying injected all of his power into High Spear, causing a grate to be emitted from the spear. The earth started shaking intensely and the soil melted rapidly. Not long after, a thin layer of lava was covering the ground near Ji Ying and was spreading towards the surrounding areas. The Jia clan warrior who was facing Ji Ying held the bola in his left hand and took a step sideways, then twisted his body at a weird angle, and dodged Ji Ying's attack. The spearhead sliced through the air, an inch away from his face, but didn't touch even a hair of his. Ji Ying had missed his target. Before he had landed back on the ground and was able to adjust his posture, the Jia clan warrior threw a punch at his throat instantaneously. Ji Ying let out a very muffled moan, lost his breath and showed the whites of his eyes. After that, the Jia clan warrior raised the bola and heavily hit against the back of Ji Ying's head with it. Ji Ying shouted out in pain, fell hard on the ground, causing his body to twitch continuously. Ji Ying. Ji Lang growled and jumped up, rushed towards the Jia clan warrior who was standing in front of Ji Ying. The other Jia clan warrior seemed to have already foreseen his plan. Once Ji Ying moved his feet, he put a heavy shield, which had abruptly appeared from nowhere in front of his partner. Ji Lang hadn't seen this coming. He bumped hard against the shield, his head broke instantly and blood spurted out. Ji Hao's pupils constricted to the size of pinpoint when he saw what happened. The attacks of these two Jia clan warriors were so clean and straight. It seemed like they had practiced this thousands of times. Ji Ying and Ji Lang, two powerful young senior magi, were each knocked down by a single attack. Ji Hao felt as if the Jia clan warrior weren't even humans, they were more like two fighting machines. Chapter 36, Crisis. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 36. Crisis. Ha. Hee hee. Yo ho ho ho. Ho ho. Ho. Seeing Ji Ying and Ji Lang lying on the ground and trying to struggle back up with faces covered in blood, all of the savages, who was badly frightened by Ji Hao's slaughter and struck dumb by the death of their leader, have now started shouting and jumping for joy. Due to the generally low intelligence of these savages, their behavior was animal-like. Once their leader has been defeated, they would turn and flee right away, but if their leader has gotten the upper hand in a battle, they would become the most ferocious warriors and tear every single enemy into pieces. At this point of time, they picked up their weapons and turned around, glared at Ji Hao and the Coldbrook Valley behind him while shouting and clamoring. The scary enemies just killed their leader have been knocked down by their honored guests, which largely encouraged these flurried savages who were just about to run. Human. A lot of humans. Meat. Delicious meat. Olds, chewy. Youngs, tasty bdnvl.m and women. Hey. Women. Hee. Women, mine. The savage was drooling and yelling while they approached Ji Hao carefully. The bigger their steps were, the greater courage they had. Abruptly, one among them gave a growl, then thousands of savages started rushing toward Ji Hao and the Coldbrook Valley with their weapons raised high. How? Step back. Quick. A Qin Yi clan warriors shouted to Ji Hao from the top of the unfinished fence wall. Tens of Qin Yi clan warriors then pulled their bows and shot hundreds of arrows in the span of 2 breaths. Wisps of arrows whizzed through the air and flew into the savage crowd like an intense rain. The remarkable shooting skill of the Qin Yi clan warriors allowed every single arrow winded a unique path through the air like snake wiggling. The arrows went through 1, and 2, and 3, even more of the savages' throats. Each of the arrows pierced, at least, 3 savages' throats. One of them even punctured 15 madly running savages' throats, then finally stuck in the ground slantingly. Immediately, blood splashed everywhere, covered the earth and the sky. A few savages who were running in front of the crowd fell on the ground, howled and struggled painfully with their hands around their punctured necks, then died soon. The momentary courage of the savages has now gone without a trace. Those savages luckily survived the arrows started screaming terrifyingly. They dropped their weapons and fled in the opposite direction of the Coldbrook Valley with all of their remaining strength. The 2 armored Jia clan warriors frowned and shook their heads. These useless wastes. These savages are no better than animals. They're even not qualified to be slaves. We have to do this ourselves, said the Jia clan warrior who held a bola in his hands. He then sneered and continued. The 2 of us are enough to capture the entire valley. The Jia clan warrior with heavy shield and sword let out a sneer as well and said. We still need these savages to send all these captives out of the valley for us. We can't let those arrow men kill all of them. The Jia clan warrior hung his shield on his belt, then held his sword with his left hand and crooked his middle finger of the other hand toward Ji Hao, slightly raised the left corner of his upper lip and said with a mocking smile. Hey, little kid, such a young Magusriasts. You're really good. Come, let us see what else have you got. Ji Hao took a deep breath. His black pupils suddenly turned into a gold-red color, 9 spell symbols of the 9 secret words loomingly appeared around both of his pupils. The power of the 9 secret words began to drag the nature power into Ji Hao's body, even darkened the day glow tens of feet around Ji Hao. The Jia clan warriors curiously looked at Ji Hao and showed no sign of attack. Obviously, they didn't take Ji Hao serious at all, they were just curious about what Ji Hao was going to perform for them. How? Back. You can't deal with M. Ji Ying shouted. He was hit hard on the back head by the Bola warrior and almost lost his consciousness. He has now leaped up from the ground and raised his ablaze spear and stabbed toward the Jia clan warrior's neck. The spear left a huge arc of fiery light in the air. The life force of the senior magi were extraordinarily strong. The heavy Bola punch may have the head of an ordinary man smashed, however, Ji Ying was only felt dizzy after he was hit by the Bola, and soon recovered from it, rose and fought again with his full power. At the same time, Ji Lang, whose forehead was bumped and broken, face covered with blood, leaped high in the air as well. He jerked out a black dagger and poked toward the other Jia clan warrior's face. In the meanwhile, he also shouted to Ji Hao. Hao, draw back. Quick. Everyone stay back. 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 Ji Hao calmly looked at Ji Ying and Ji Lang, didn't move. Mr. Crow quietly stood on Ji Hao's shoulder and ruffled his feathers. He fixed his eyes into the dense jungle, where all these enemies came from, and totally ignored the 2 Jia clan warriors. Ji Ying and Ji Lang cast their counterattacks simultaneously. However, the two Jia clan warriors suddenly stretched out their arms at exact the same moment and grabbed the necks of Ji Ying and Ji Lang, smashed them hard to the ground. The earth shook intensely. Ji Ying and Ji Lang's body then deeply bumped into the ground. Kill! Ji Ying gave a roar from the hundreds of feet deep hole his body crushed into, then jumped out of the hole with his body wrapped by a blazing fire and rushed toward the Jia clan warrior again. We're senior magi from the Fire Crow clan. Ji Lang spat a mouthful of blood out and also jumped out of the other hole. His dagger has gone missing when he was hit into the ground. He has now clenched his fists and throwing punches to the Jia clan warrior. They're way stronger than you. Way stronger. Ji Hao gnashed his teeth and growled in a low voice. Why you have to be so stubborn? Do you have to risk your lives against these guys? Both of the two Jia clan warriors took a step aside and easily dodged the attacks of Ji Ying and Ji Lang. Their actions were so unified, which gave a weird feeling that was very hard to explain. They avoided Ji Ying and Ji Lang's attacks with only one simple step, then crooked their arms and leaned their upper body forward, struck hard on Ji Ying and Ji Lang's lower bellies simultaneously with their hard, hammer-like elbows. Ji Ying and Ji Lang were sent flying backward instantly like cannonballs. Their body sliced through the air, started a sharp air steam, even cut a tens of feet long and 5 feet wide ditch into the ground. The two of them then fell on the ground heavily near Ji Hao's feet, their eyes widened and blood gushed out of their mouths. This time, they were seriously injured, couldn't rise again even with the strong life force of senior magi. The Jia clan warrior with a sword then crooked his finger and sneered to Ji Hao again. Come on, little guy, let me see have you got. You think I'm stupid? Ji Hao showed his middle finger to the Jia clan warriors without a thought of whether they could understand the meaning of this hand gesture. He then grabbed Ji Ying and Ji Lang with both of his hands and resealed the power inside his body, transformed into a stream of fiery light and disappeared. At the next second, Ji Hao appeared near the entrance of the valley with Ji Ying and Ji Lang held in his arms. Retreat! Ji Hao shouted while running madly toward the end of the valley. Uncles, retreat! The enemies are too powerful. We have to wait for Abba and other warriors to come back. Retreat! Just leave these slaves here. Tens of Qingyi clan's warriors quickly drew close to Ji Hao. Other Fire Crow clan warriors who were guarding the valley followed Ji Hao and ran toward the end of the valley as well. However, two figures then broke into the valley like a tornado. They burst into the crowd of Fire Crow clan and Qingyi clan warriors and sent tens of them flying. These warriors then fell hard on the ground thousands of feet away and couched up blood ceaselessly. Ji Hao stopped running, because he saw the Jia clan warriors were waiting in front of him with that mocking sneers on their faces. They moved too fast. Ji Hao didn't even saw how they broke into the valley clearly. Chapter 37, Puppet. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 37. Puppet. Ji Hao stopped by the two Jia clan warriors. The slaves near Ji Hao were all huddled up on the ground and trembled in fear. From the cold brook laid aside, the fat bear jumped out abruptly. The bear's fur was soaking wet. It leaped high in the air and raised its huge paw and slapped toward one of the Jia clan warriors. Fady! Get away! Ji Hao's eye corners twitched, he let out a growl anxiously. The bear's beady eyes turned into a blood red, thick strands of viscous white saliva hung from the corners of its mouth, every single of its hairs risen on end like steel needles, and the huge bear paw started a gust of fierce wind. The bear showed no sign of stop. The Jia clan warrior aimed by the bear raised his head, threw a sideway glance at the bear with that mocking smile remained on his face. He then quickly took a big step sideway, moved to under the bear's body and punched the bear's belly with his right fist. This punch sent the gigantic bear flying into the air. The bear flew a mile away like a small, flying mountain, then pitched into the cold brook. The water rapidly turned red and then bear slowly floated up, drifted down along with the water flow, then got stuck by several giant stones in the middle of the brook. At the end of the valley, swirls of dust rose thousands of feet high in the air. Tens of Fire Crow warriors who were guarding the end of the valley were rushing toward Ji Hao and the others. They shouted aloud when they saw the two Jia clan warriors. Looming fiery lights appeared behind their bodies. They raised their arms and threw their spears to the Jia clan warriors across a distance of miles. Tens of mulberry wood spears were all wrapped by the blazing fire and darted toward the two Jia clan warriors in different paths, blocked all the possible side steps that the Jia clan warriors might take to dodge the attack. The Jia clan warrior with the sword turned his head and gave a creepy smile to Ji Hao, who was having a very serious facial expression. The Jia clan warrior then took the shield which was hung around his waist and raised it high, then cast an odd spell. The shield suddenly emitted an eye-piercing light. The light soon formed an immense light shield in front of the two Jia clan warriors. At the next second, all of the spears then shuddered against the light shield along with a thundering bang, while the light shield stood firmly without even a shake. Ji Hao noticed that there was a familiar totem embossed on the surface of the Jia clan warrior's shield, a tower with a blood-red eye floating on top of it. That eye was shining with a blood-red light, very lifelike. Ji Hao gazed at that eye, shivered subconsciously. Another Jia clan warrior dropped his bola and soothed the bone joints of his fingers. He thrust his hands toward the tens of Fire Crow warriors who were rushing toward him and his partner. His 10 fingers then started flicking like he was playing a pipa. 1. The air near his fingertips then started popping. Countless fist-sized, dagger-like sharp gusts of winds darted out from near his fingers and suddenly hit on those Fire Crow warriors' bodies. Every single flick of the Jia clan warriors' fingers sent hundreds of gusts of winds toward those Fire Crow clan warriors. These dagger-like winds broke their bones, pierced their arms and legs, hollowed their chests. Those Fire Crow warriors had no preparation for this. They were trembling intensely and vomiting blood, seemed as weak as grasses under the attack of these weird winds. Soon, all of the Fire Crow warriors were sent flying backward by the rain-storm like sharp gusts of winds. So vulnerable. I'm disappointed. Haven't met any real rival yet, said one of the Jia clan warriors. The other Jia clan warrior stooped, flicking his fingers. Wisps of smoke rose from his 10 fingertips, which caused by the friction between his fingers and the air. Ji Hao gnashed his teeth and started at the two horrible enemies. The shield was nothing but a Magus tool with extraordinary defensive power. However, Ji Hao didn't sense even a trace of magical power from the guy who just knocked tens of Fire Crow clan warriors down by flicked his fingers, which means that he was only popped the air with his physical strength and easily smashed a Fire Crow clan warrior team. Mr. Crow stretched his wings and slightly moved his claws, which were gripped Ji Hao's shoulder. A trace of cruelty flashed through his blood-red pupils. Ji Hao patted Mr. Crow and slightly shook his head. He has known Mr. Crow since he was a newborn baby. He clearly understood the meaning of Mr. Crow's actions. There are some more powerful enemies who were hiding in that dense jungle all this time, which was why Mr. Crow didn't pay any attention to the Jia clan warriors and kept a vigilant watch to the jungle. You're very powerful. However, this is our Fire Crow clan's territory. Ji Hao stared at the two Jia clan warriors who wasn't even gasping after all this, and said seriously. No matter where you came from, you have invaded our territory, you. This place is far, far away from the center of your Fire Crow clan. We're not afraid the revenge from your clan at all. Are you trying to stall us? Little guy, I have to admit that you surprised me. This cleverness of yours will make you worth even more. The Jia clan warrior with sword interrupted Ji Hao speaking. He looked at Ji Hao up and down with his 4 cold eyes. The other Jia clan warrior picked up his bola, waved it, then grinned and said to Ji Hao. You'll be worth a fortune. I feel like I'm looking at piles of gold and jade. We can live a happy and comfortable life for a long while. All the warriors guarding the Coldbrook Valley were knocked down by this time. Groups of savages rushed into the valley. These savages had no sense of rules. They started damaging everything once they got into the valley. Thanks to Ji Shu and his people, there were nothing like foods or equipment worth to be rubbed in the Coldbrook Valley. The savages rummaged for a while, then fixed their eyes on those slaves who were still huddled up on the ground. Meat. Smells so good. Savages rubbed their hands and walking toward those slaves. They have fought hard for quite a while. At this point, they were all starving. The savages could eat all living things. Now these slaves who were powerless to resist were the best food to them. A friction sound came from the jungle. 3 enormous metal beings walked fast out of the jungle along with the cracking branch sounds. Ji Hao looked at the 3 gigantic things stunningly. They looked like 3 huge metal spiders. The bodies were over 20 feet tall and the spider legs were nearly 100 feet long, which allowed them to move surprisingly fast. Soon, the 3 metal spider got into the Coldbrook Valley. They opened their mouths and made an ear-piercing sound. The savages who were approaching those slaves started screaming immediately and trying to block the sound by covering their ears with their hands. They then left those slaves and fled away. The 3 metal spiders quickly walked up behind Ji Hao while driving savages away and slowly lowered their bodies. The body of the metal spider in the middle opened a crack abruptly. A cold voice came from inside it. Tie all the captives up. Now we only have to wait until the other people to come back and take care of them too, then we can finish this perfect hunting. The voice paused for a second, then chuckled. It's worth the wait. We have waited in the damn jungle for over a month. I'm very satisfied for our harvest this time. 1. Pipa. A plucked string instrument with a fretted fingerboard. Chapter 38, Counterattack. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 38. Counterattack. Ji Hao's heart was in confusion. Ji Hao could explain the full metal armors which were wearing by the Jia clan warriors with his previous life knowledge, but this 3 incomparably exquisite and agile walking metal spiders were completely beyond Ji Hao's imagination. BDNVL.M. You Southerners are really ignorant. I bet you've never seen anything as terrific as this. Once we sell you at a good price, us, the Blood Tooth, can purchase another 2 best quality sword-edge spiders, then it'll be even more convenient for us to travel around the South Wasteland jungle. The Jia clan warrior with shield and sword sensed Ji Hao's astonishment and confusion. He pointed at the metal spiders and boasted, "Hey, little guy, these are sword-edge spiders, the fighting puppets crafted by Xiu clan's master craftsmen. They running very fast, with good defensive quality, and we're very satisfied with their large-scale lethality. They're the most suitable equipment for travel around in this rough mountain area." Toba, you talk too much. Along with a metal friction sound, a metal ladder stretched out from the metal spider's body. A young man, who was tall and thin, wrapped his cloak around himself and slowly walked down the ladder. Ji Hao looked at the young man, popped up his eyes. The young man was only fists long shorter than the Jia clan warriors. He has an extremely slim body shape. At the first glance, his waist was even no thicker than the Jia clan warriors' arms. The young man's skin was as white as the best mutton fat jade. His face was like an exquisitely carved sculpture, breathtakingly beautiful but with a slight trace of evil. Ji Hao even felt this young man was too pretty, that even didn't look like a human. The purple cloak he was wearing was also extraordinarily ornate. Ji Hao recognized the texture of the cloak. It was the best quality silk. On its surface, there was complicated pattern embroidered with multicolored silk threads by complicated embroidering process. In the South Wasteland, people mostly use hides to make clothes. Even the most primitive self-woven linen is very rare. Abruptly saw a luxurious cloak like this, Ji Hao got a strange feeling of time and space travel. More astonishingly, on the forehead of the young man, there was an erect eye located between his eyebrows. The erect eye was a circle bigger than the other eyes, and was rolling agilely in his eye socket. Circles of looming blue lights was flashing in the erect eye. 3.3 eyes. Ji Hao was stunned, gazed at the young man. What's wrong with 3 eyes? All three eyes of that young man narrowed down simultaneously and looked at Ji Hao coldly and said. As my captive, little guy, your attitude should be more respectful. For example, if you kneel down right now, I can make you suffer less. The young man then frowned and continued. What's that look? Do you think I'm a freak? To me, you people are freaks, monsters, barbarians, dirty and stupid savages. Stinky jungle apes. Toba, Toa, what are you waiting for? Just tied this kid up. We can use him to treat his father later. His father is different from those two new senior magi. You don't want to deal with a powerful senior magi with over 40 vacant Magus caves, do you? The young man then twitched his mouth corners downward and showed a face of disgust, waved his hands and said. The sword-edge spiders were really high-speed equipment. They got into the cold brook valley in only the span of a few breaths after they walked out of the jungle. Until the three-eyed young man showed up in front of Ji Hao, a troop rushed out of the jungle. There were over 200 of sturdy men with fierce looks in the troop. All of these men were over 2 meters tall and wearing simple metal armors, their skins were as dark as irons, their right hands were holding heavy shields and left hands holding swords and other weapons. These men were walking fast and orderly, they separated into groups of 3 and moved alternately and covered mutually. Every move that these men made left Ji Hao with an elite warrior impression. They followed the metal spiders and got into the Coldbrook Valley, started to tie those harmed Fire Crow clan warriors with vines and give commands to those savage warriors. The three-eyed young man heard the troop, unconsciously took a glance back and gave an order loudly. Kill all old, sick and disabled people. It's a shame to waste foods on those garbages. Tie all the strong warriors and slaves up. This time. We're gonna make a good price. Toba and Toa also distracted by the troop for a moment. Ji Ying and Ji Lang were badly injured, and Ji Hao was only a novice magus. Though Toba and Toa have always been very cautious, now they have relaxed their vigilance. Ji Hao took this chance. He dropped Ji Ying and Ji Lang, who were still coughing up blood from time to time, and whispered the 9 secret words. Once Ji Hao's voice faded, the ground under Toba and Toa's feet suddenly became a pool of slurry. Toba and Toa shouted out, fell into the slurry pool and unpreparedly and soon submerged in the slurry pool. The three-eyed young man jerked his head back when he heard the plump, and stared at Ji Hao as if Ji Hao was a ghost. 3 sword-edged spiders' eyes emitted a piercing red light, they then leaped high into the air and speared toward Ji Hao's chest with their long metal legs. The sword-edged spiders moved fleetingly, Ji Hao couldn't even saw their moves clearly. Luckily, Ji Hao had no need of defense. Mr. Crow enlarged its body into his real size in a blink of an eye, streams of fire darted out from every single feather on his wings, he then flapped his enormous wings toward those metal spiders for 3 times. Instantly, cracking sounds came from inside the metal spiders' bodies, all 3 of them were then sent flying by the fierce air flow. The metal spiders flew miles away and fell hard on the ground, their bodies were still wrapped by a blazing fire and soon became glowing red, finally turned into a puddle of iron melt. Mr. Crow then rose high into the air and grabbed toward the three-eyed young man's head with his huge and sharp claws. The three-eyed young man raised his head panically, a blue light flashed across his erect eye, then a sharp gust of cyan wind darted out from his erect eye. The cyan wind quickly dilated to thousands of feet wide and started rotating rapidly. The cyan wind wrapped up Mr. Crow's body and rolled him high to the air. Numerous sharp wind knives lashed his steel like hard feathers and splashed fire sparkles. Wisps of hot blood dropped from the air. Mr. Crow was harmed by the wind from the three-eyed young man's erect eye. Angry roars came from the slurry pool. Toba and Toa tried everything to get rid of the slurry, however, there were nothing to hold or step on in that pool. It seemed that they couldn't get out of that slurry pool for a while. Ji Hao found out the weakness of the Jia clan warriors, they had enormous physical strength but knew nothing about magical power and sorceries. Went from one extreme to another. If the Jia clan warriors only had physical strength, then what about the three-eyed young man? Ji Hao thought. Kill. Ji Hao let out a growl. His body then transformed into thousands of fire sparkles and appeared behind the three-eyed young man at the next moment. He locked his hands together, cast a spell, then palm struck on the three-eyed young man's back with all of his power. All three eyes of the young man were nearly popped out from his eye sockets. A stream of blood spurted out from his mouth. He felt like even his internal organs were about to flew out of his boy through his mouth. Bastard! Toby and Toa finally sank to the bottom of the slurry pool. They stamped hard on the pool bottom and then leaped high into the air, heavily landed on the ground beside the slurry pool. 1. Mutton fat jade. Creamy white Chinese nephrite is referred to as mutton fat jade, and most of it is found near the city of Hotan in China. Chapter 39, Stalemated. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 39. Stalemated. Ba.be * starred. The three-eyed young man cursed with a trembling voice. He was vomiting blood, and soon, his nose and ears also started bleeding. The Danyuan, 1, Ji Hao gained from the years of practice on the mantra Dan with 9 secret words was changeful, which means that Ji Hao could choose what kind of power to use when he cast an attack. The power he used to hit the three-eyed young man just now was wild and strong, like the heaven was falling and the earth was cracking, like the eruption of a volcano. The power burst suddenly, caused great damage to the three-eyed young man's internal organs directly. Toba and Toa finally got out of that slurry pool. They wiped the slurry on their faces clean embarrassedly, then saw their leader was sent flying by Ji Hao's punch and seemed seriously injured. Die. Toba raised his sword. A fierce cyan wind started around the sword. A cyan phantom of the sword appeared a few feet away from the sword edge and chopped toward Ji Hao. Toa picked up his bola and darted toward the three-eyed young man as well, left a piece of shadow behind him. He stretched his arms and threw out his chest, seemed that he was going to shield the young man with his own body. Sharp cawing came from the sky. Mr. Crow, who was sent away by the wind from the young man's erect eye, now was diving down from the air. His wings were shaking and ejecting innumerable ablaze black feathers toward Toba and Toa. Those feathers were falling from the air like raindrops. Every single feather was with a tens of feet long tail of black smoke. Toba and Toa let out roars half angrily and half sorrowfully. Faced Mr. Crow's attack, they took a deep breath, standing firmly. Several smooth lines lit up on the surface of their armors. Tens of fist-sized spell symbols then emerged from the surface of the armors and started to flash with a piercing light. They kept their heads down and let those ablaze feathers hit on their bodies. Followed by thundering noises, the feathers overwhelmed their bodies. Mr. Crow was cawing sharply. A 10 feet long fire stream spurted out from his blood-red eyes. Toba and Toa's bodies were trembling intensely. The spell symbols on the surface of their armors were rapidly flashing. From time to time, feathers broke through the spell symbols' light and hit on the armors, left deep cuts on them. Every second, Mr. Crow threw over 10,000 of feathers toward Toba and Toa. These feathers had an unknown source, seemed like the incessant river flow, flushing through the armors of Toba and Toa. The armors of Toba and Toa were lashing by the feathers. Large fire sparkles often broke out from near their bodies and armor fragments kept falling on the ground. Suddenly, Toba let out a howl. His shoulder pauldrons were completely damaged by the feathers. 3 6-feet long ablaze feathers pierced his shoulders and stuck by his scapulas. The 3 feathers were wrapped by gold-red flame, which was burning Toba's shoulder. A stinky smell of burned meat spread around. Toba's face was badly twisted in pain. Toa has now forgotten to cover the three-eyed young man. Instead, he opened his arms and tried to catch the feathers which were flying toward Toba. Ji Hao darted up behind the three-eyed young man, who was coughing up blood and trying to flee. Ji Hao's fists moved in a lightning speed and brought out tens of phantoms, punching toward the young man. The young man's body trembled violently, blood was continuously spurting out from his mouth. Die! The young man, who was nearly smashed by Ji Hao's punches, abruptly turned around his head, the erect eye between his eyebrows suddenly lit up, a tens of feet long sharp wind knife darted out of that eye along with an ear-piercing sound. However, once the young man turned his head, Ji Hao quickly threw a smack on his face. Before the wind knife darted out, the young man was whirled by Ji Hao's smack. The sharp wind knife from his erect eye then sliced the air through an inch away from Ji Hao's face, darted to 10,000 feet away in the blink of an eye. The wind knife was incomparably sharp, it split all of the rocks and plants in its path. Tens of unlucky savage warriors who were standing in its path didn't even make any noticeable sounds before they were sliced into two pieces by the wind knife. Along with a cloud of crimson mist, the wind knife exploded into a cyan whirlwind in 10,000 feet away, rolled up hundreds of palm-sized wind knives and shattered everything in hundreds of feet round, then subsided slowly. Ji Hao was slightly shocked by the power of the wind knife. This wind knife has such a scary power. If cast a wind knife like this in a battle, it probably can kill at least hundreds of enemies. Ji Hao said in his head. Ji Hao didn't wait until the three-eyed young man realized what was happening. He grabbed the young man's cyan long hair and threw a kick to the vital part between his legs masterly. Before that, the young man was shaking his head and trying to fight back. Now he stooped down instinctively and covered the vital parts between his legs which were badly harmed with his hands. Kneel down. You, kneel down. Ji Hao growled and kicked the young man with his right leg. Within the span of one breath, Ji Hao has thrown at least 100 heavy kicks on the young man's shanks. Along with loud thuds, Ji Hao felt that his toe bones were nearly shattered. Finally, with a cracking sound, the young man's shank bones broke into a few pieces. Damn bastard! The three-eyed young man screamed out, tears and snot gushed out simultaneously. Ji Hao jerked out a dagger and poked it into the young man's mouth while he was screaming and cursing, then started cutting the inside of his mouth. Ji Hao shook his wrist, felt like he was cutting a piece of leather with a blunt knife. He spent a lot of effort and finally sliced the young man's tongue. The young man's body twitched intensely in great pain, then suddenly became soft and lost the power of resistance. Mr. Crow cawed and landed on the ground, opened its beak and spurted out a stream of gold-red flame toward Toba and Toa. Toba and Toa howled simultaneously when they saw that the three-eyed young man was captured by Ji Hao. They ignored Mr. Crow's flame and darted out like they were running from the death. They went up to Ji Ying and Ji Lang who were badly injured and lied on the ground, then pulled Ji Ying and Ji Lang up and held them in front of their chests. Mr. Crow suddenly popped up his eyes when he saw that Ji Ying and Ji Lang was going to burn by his fire. He then largely opened his beak and breathed the fire back. Bang! The fire drew back to Mr. Crow's lung and soon exploded inside his body. 2 wisps of smoke puffed out from his nose. Mr. Crow was choked by the smoke and cawing loudly, tears gushed out from his blood-red eye sockets. Ji Hao held the dagger against the young man's temple and twisted his wrist. The dagger tip cut the young man's soft skin open. Only if Ji Hao pushed harder, the dagger would be poked into the young man's head. Release! Release them! Ji Hao looked at Ji Ying and Ji Lang, who was grabbed in Toba and Toa's hands and growled. If you don't want this three-eyed kid die, you better release them now. You release our captain first. Now! Said Toba and Toa. Their eyes turned into red and their bronze skin turned slightly black. Besides the 2 of them, we have many more of your people. The underlings of the three-eyed young man, who walked out of the jungle earlier as a troop have now showed up. Each of them was holding a Fire Crow clan warrior or a Qing-Yi clan warrior on their hands. All of those warriors were badly injured by Toba and Toa and powerless to resist. Kill 3 first. Ji Hao was about to say something, Toba interrupted him and shouted out. Three dark-skinned muscular men gave growls and chopped the heads of the warriors held in their hands off backhandedly. Kill! Ji Hao roared in rage, then poked the dagger into the right eye socket of the young man, dug out one of his eyeballs wholly without any hesitation. You think that I won't dare to kill a man? Let's die together. Ji Hao roared and threw the eyeball on the ground, trod it into a paste. Toba and Toa stared at Ji Hao stunningly, like they were seeing a ghost. The Coldbrook Valley suddenly became as quiet as dead. 1. Dan Yuan. A concentrated form of power. While a magus practice on a certain type of magical spells, the power he gained will gather together and form a Dan Yuan inside his body. During the fight, the magus can trigger the Dan Yuan and release the power from it.